It's the case of the moment,
Making a Murderer has
a national obsession.
So many people binging on the 10-part series.
When Netflix premiered the documentary Making a Murderer in December 2015, it ignited a passionate debate and a media storm.
Stephen Avery, he was convicted. That man's right where he needs to be.
Are Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cold-blooded killers or victims of a frame?
Lo and behold, the key magically appears. Highly suspicious.
Could an exonerated folk hero actually be guilty the second time around?
All of the evidence here pointed to one person.
Now, heated reaction from both sides.
I'm not surprised that people are outraged by it. They should be.
This film purposely left out very important evidence. Teresa Halbach was targeted by Stephen Avery.
And a new debate on the evidence.
How do you think the blood got in there? There was a nurse that said, I'm the one that put the hole in there.
If you looked carefully, there's blood in between the stopper and the glass.
It all leads to one burning question.
If not Stephen Avery, who?
An in-depth look at the evidence, the key players, and the uproar surrounding the case. Stephen Avery, innocent or guilty? There are stories of double jeopardy. And then there's a strange and controversial case of Stephen Avery. Wrongfully convicted, spent 18 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, only to find himself back behind bars 2 years later, charged in a separate case. Is it possible for a man to be wrongly jailed, not once, but twice, for two different crimes? Or has justice finally been served? It's a remarkable whodunit, a legal thriller, full of twists and turns that are still being played out, and that put the local sheriffs and the court and the justice system itself on trial. And it all began back in 1985. It was a sunny July afternoon, and a young woman named Penny Bernston was jogging on a quiet stretch of beach on Lake Michigan.
A man lunged at Penny, and he grabbed her and took her over the dunes.
I kicked him in the groin, and he said, now I'm going to kill you, now you're going to die. And he began beating me primarily about the head.
When a brutally raped and badly battered Penny was rushed to the hospital, she told her story to Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputies, and right away, one of them suggested a suspect. 23-year-old Stephen Avery, a man with a criminal past, including petty burglaries and an animal cruelty case.
Stephen Avery doused the cat with gasoline and threw it intentionally into the fire.
Stephen came from a family with a certain reputation.
The Avery family is best known for running the Avery Auto Salvage, sprawling property, old junked cars dotted all over the place.
They're a big clan, and a number of them live on the property.
There is that sense of, oh, that's the people from the junkyard, and they're sort of off on their own, and some of them get into trouble once in a while.
In fact, just 6 months before the attack on the beach, Stephen Avery was arrested for trying to run one of his neighbors off the road because, he claimed, she was spreading false rumors about him.
Mr. Avery's intent was actually to assault the woman. After all, he rammed his pickup truck into her car, and he held her at rifle point.
It just so happened the woman was married to a sheriff's deputy, so no surprise, Stephen was very much on the department's radar.
When news of this sexual assault on a beach came up, the sheriff's department almost immediately fixed on Stephen Avery as the subject.
The police artist basically manipulated Penny Bernston into creating a sketch that looked just like Mr. Avery's mugshot from 6 months ago.
And thus, hours after the assault, Penny picked Stephen from a photo array. And he was arrested.
I think my confidence that I had selected the right person was boosted when I was told that the person they arrested was the suspect that they had in mind.
But Stephen denied it and had an alibi. At his trial, 16 witnesses took the stand to swear that Stephen was with them on the afternoon of the attack. Of course, almost all of them were members of his family, so
I think a lot of members of the community did have preconceived notions about the Avery family, which made it difficult for him to get a fair trial, frankly.
the jury found Stephen Avery guilty of rape and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 32 years. He continued to insist he was innocent, but his appeal went nowhere. And then, in 2002, the Wisconsin Innocence Project sent a hair from the original rape kit to the state crime lab for testing.
It was the last hair, the last shred of evidence that could have been tested.
And it was not his hair, meaning he could not have been the rapist. He was telling the truth all along. And so, in September 2003, Stephen Avery was finally set free.
Mr. Avery's release was a very large media event.
How you doing? Oh, hello. How are you?
And Mr. Avery then became sort of a folk hero.
It was a double win for justice. The DNA freed an innocent man and identified the actual assailant, a man named Gregory Allen, already in prison for another rape.
Law enforcement had every reason to look at Mr. Allen in 1985. That summer, Mr. Allen was breaking into women's homes. He had assaulted a 16-year-old woman in Manitowoc at the time. It's pretty clear to anybody who really looks at this in any serious way that the sheriff and the district attorney basically railroaded Mr. Avery, all along letting the real assailant go free.
But even after all those 18 lost years, Stephen met and forgave the woman whose identification put him in prison.
And are all her fault, honest mistake,
I've described it as one of the most grace-filled moments of my life, that someone who has served 18 years for a crime they didn't commit can say to the person who identified them, I don't blame you, it wasn't your fault.
Stephen had someone else in mind when it came to blame, and filed a $36 million lawsuit in federal court against Manitowoc County, the former sheriff, and the former district attorney. County officials denied any wrongdoing, but then came the depositions, which revealed that they may have gotten a crucial lead in 1995, 10 years after Avery was arrested.
A call comes into the jail from a person who apparently is a detective saying, I've got information on that sexual assault case. I think you guys got the wrong guy.
If anyone had followed up on that call, the lawyers argued, Stephen Avery could have been freed 8 years earlier.
Everything what they did wrong should come back at them.
What a turnaround. By the fall of 2005, the Wisconsin legislature was voting on the Avery bill to change police investigation techniques, and the federal lawsuit was moving forward quickly.
His lawyers were very close to finishing up depositions and were ready to present the case in probably a very large settlement.
Then a young woman went missing, and the story of Stephen Avery suddenly seemed very dark indeed. Wrongly imprisoned for 18 years, Stephen Avery was enjoying the kind of turnaround only imagined in fiction. A $36 million lawsuit against the authorities that imprisoned him was on track, and the Wisconsin legislature was about to sign a brand new bill in his honor. And then, just after Halloween 2005, everything changed. It was November 3rd, and a young woman was reported missing. Hadn't been heard from for 4 days. Teresa Hallback was 25, pretty, a budding photographer of portraits, pictures of cars for sale. She'd been active in her church. She coached their girls' volleyball team. But now she was gone. Vanished.
We need everybody's help. Please keep looking.
The last time and place Teresa was seen alive was October 31st, heading to shoot photos of a car.
Hello, this is Teresa with Auto Trader Magazine. I'm the photographer, and I'm just giving a call to let you know that I could come out there today.
That appointment was at Stephen Avery's family business, the Avery Salvage Yard. And so a search began.
I know if I was missing, I'd want somebody looking for me, and she's a good person.
Friends and Halbach family members spread out to hunt for any sign of Teresa or her car. And on November 5th, they found something.
I'm on the search for Teresa Halbach, and we found a RAV4. It's weird. It's covered up.
Where are you?
I'm at Avery Salvage.
And right away, Stephen Avery became a prime suspect. The sheriffs closed off the 40-acre Avery family compound and conducted a series of exhaustive searches from Avery's red trailer and his garage to the site where Teresa's SUV was found. It was the beginning of what some say was the framing of Stephen Avery. For 8 days they searched. 8 days in which law enforcement alone had access to Avery's home and property.
There were 3,800 vehicles. Each one of them had to be searched for anything that might be relevant to this case.
I'll never forget the scene that day. Almost 100 law enforcement officers from different agencies searching the premises, media helicopters flying overhead.
With Avery's wrongful conviction lawsuit looming against Manitowoc County, outside DA Ken Kratz was appointed as a special prosecutor. And the Sheriff's Department in neighboring Calumet County was named the lead investigative agency to avoid any chance of a conflict of interest.
I also want to emphasize that the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department's role in this was to provide resources for us when they were needed. And that's their only role in this investigation.
But Avery had his concerns.
What I feel like, that they're going to railroad me again, set me up. Or they set me up the first time. I had to do it 18 years to prove my innocence, you know. Now they want to redo it and see if they can get me or plant evidence so I don't get back out.
Oh, they did find evidence in Teresa's car, and it did not look good for Stephen Avery.
Sunday, the 6th of November, the crime lab made some startling discoveries.
A significant amount of blood was also discovered in Teresa Halbach's vehicle.
In 6 different places in the SUV, they found the blood of Stephen Avery.
But not just Avery's blood, Teresa's too. And then, soon after,
Significant evidence has been discovered over the past 24 hours at the Avery Salvage Yard.
Inside the burn pit, police officers found some charred remains, some bones that appeared to be of a human, female.
We were able to identify a shin bone. Nuclear DNA testing showed it to be Teresa Halbach. Clearly, those bones were left in an area 20 feet from Stephen Avery's door.
On November 15th, Stephen Avery was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. Once again, he confronted a legal system bent on proving his guilt. Once again, he maintained his innocence.
What do you want to say today?
I'm innocent.
But as the prosecutors assembled their case, the clues kept coming. Clues that would become the symbols of this controversial story. Like the key to Teresa's car in Stephen's bedroom.
Sergeant Colburn was moving around a little cabinet that was in the bedroom area, and that upon putting it back, he and Sergeant Link noticed a key. It simply fell and ended up on the floor.
Whose DNA was on the key?
Stephen Avery, when he handled this key, left skin cells on the key.
And several months later, inside Stephen Avery's cluttered garage,
officers searched the garage. A bullet was found back underneath a compressor. Another bullet was found in a crack in the concrete. And on one of the bullets that the officers collected, the DNA of Teresa Halbach was found.
Ballistics experts said it had been fired from the .22 caliber rifle hanging over Stephen Avery's bed.
If you have a bullet that's fired from Stephen Avery's gun, and that bullet passed through the body of Teresa Halbach, there was an excellent chance that we knew exactly not only who killed her, but how she was killed.
It was a steady stream of incriminating evidence.
She's last seen at the junkyard. Her vehicle is found at the junkyard. There's her blood in her vehicle. Her body parts are found on the property. That has to be explained somehow.
For prosecutors, it all built to one inescapable conclusion. But Kratz was still concerned.
This wasn't a case I had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a case I had to prove beyond all doubt.
The only thing lacking seemed to be an eyewitness. And then, Stephen Avery's nephew, 16-year-old Brendan Dassey, told a startling story.
We believed he probably knew more than what he was saying. So officers re-interviewed Brendan Dassey. He made statements about helping his uncle clean up the garage, about seeing some body parts and things in a fire.
Breaking news out of Calumet County, a horrifying account of what prosecutors say happened to Teresa Halbach.
As Brendan approaches the trailer, he hears screams for help. Brendan accompanies his 43-year-old uncle down the hallway to Stephen Avery's bedroom, and there they find Teresa Halbach completely naked and shackled to the bed. Stephen Avery at this point invites his 16-year-old nephew to sexually assault this woman that he's had bound to the bed. During the rape, Teresa is begging for help. Brendan watches Stephen Avery take a butcher knife from the kitchen and stab Teresa Halbach in the stomach. 16-year-old Brendan, under the instruction of Stephen Avery, cuts Teresa Halbach's throat, but she still doesn't die.
According to this complaint, Dassey and Avery are accused of choking Teresa Halbach and then dragging her lifeless body outside, throwing her in the burn pit, and shooting her in the head and in the stomach.
It was a lurid tale, the prosecutor told, like something out of a tawdry thriller. Stephen Avery, convicted rapist, exonerated hero, patron saint of the wrongfully convicted, was once again in the white-hot glare of the media spotlight. The evidence was, in a word, overwhelming, which raised the question, was it a little too overwhelming? Was Stephen Avery framed? Stephen Avery, hero of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, was now facing an uphill climb over a mountain of evidence connecting him to the murder of Teresa Halbach, and an unspeakably graphic description of the crime by his nephew, Brendan Dassey, had even the most skeptical observers thinking he may indeed be guilty this time.
The whole mood of Manitowoc County and the state of Wisconsin shifted. At that point, all but the most conspiracy-minded individuals among us were absolutely convinced that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were the perpetrators of the crime.
Avery needed money for lawyers, so he settled his multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Manitowoc County for $400,000 to hire two prominent attorneys. And as the trial began in February 2007, Dean Strang and Jerry Buting tried to drive home to jurors what they said was a very big problem: the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department's involvement in the investigation.
The Calumet sheriff said, look, Manitowoc is only going to provide equipment. That's their only role here. Well, that turned out not to be the case.
Detectives from the very same department Avery had been suing were deeply involved with the discovery of crucial evidence against him, starting with Teresa Halbach's car key, which had not been noticed on 6 prior searches of Avery's home.
Andy Colburn and Jim Link were the two officers from Manitowoc County who found the key to Teresa's RAV4 in Mr. Avery's bedroom.
And not only were they volunteering to be the ones that searched, but as the case developed, Manitowoc County sheriffs supposedly discovered virtually every crucial piece of evidence in this case. And, to me, that stinks to high heaven.
There was another problem, said the defense, with the car key itself.
None of Teresa Halbach's DNA was found on the key, even though it was her key and it was used regularly.
Rightly or wrongly, this sheriff's department are on that property an awful long time, search after search after search.
Remember that apparently critical bullet in the garage? Detectives had searched that garage several times, over 4 months, found nothing. But, said the defense, when those familiar faces from Manitowoc showed up,
suddenly, they go back again and discover the magic bullet that wasn't there before. And who's present at the scene? Once again, Lieutenant Link from Manitowoc Sheriff's Department.
As for the DNA testing of that bullet,
the analyst says that she found Teresa Halbach's profile on the bullet, but the test was contaminated because it had the analyst's own DNA in it.
In fact, no other physical traces of Teresa Halbach were found where Avery allegedly killed her. Not in his home, where her throat was supposedly slit, nor in the garage, where she is said to have been shot. For all the searching there, not a single drop of Teresa's blood was discovered.
And it would be difficult to clean every trace of blood out of a garage in this situation. It's either she wasn't there, or the police didn't do a significant enough job, or they did a marvelous cleanup job.
I mean, you're talking about stabbing, cast off blood all over the place. You slit someone's throat. It's a very bloody, disgusting type of way to kill somebody.
But here came the defense's most shocking allegation. Stephen Avery's blood, found inside of Teresa Halbach's car, could have been planted.
I started looking to see, well, was there any source of his blood that somebody could have found if they wanted to deliberately place it there?
In fact, there was a blood sample left over from Avery's 1985 rape case. For Beauty, this was a key moment in the case.
I could tell that the evidence tape had been slit, and lo and behold, there is a tube of blood that is still liquid, and there was a hole in the middle of the stopper. This evidence tape had been cut. By whom? When?
It had to be a frame-up, said the defense. But what about Brendan Dassey's lurid confession that both of them did all those terrible things to Teresa? The defense couldn't claim that law enforcement put the awful tale into Brendan Dassey's mouth. Or could they?
It's counterintuitive, but there is such a thing as a false confession.
In fact, said the defense, Brendan Dassey was just the kind of interrogation subject who might be pressured into telling law enforcement almost anything.
This is a 16-year-old, low-functioning intelligence level, special ed classes against very trained, experienced police officers using techniques that studies have shown are very good at getting people to confess, but also getting people to falsely confess.
Why don't you just have a seat, Brendan?
Stephen is already starting to say some things, and eventually he's gonna potentially lay some crap on you.
Be honest. You were there when she died, we know that.
Every time they ask a question like that, there's these long, pregnant pauses where he's looking down. You can tell he's just like, what is it they want me to say? And first he's like, he stabbed her in the stomach.
Well, what else did you do? Come on. Something with the head.
They start introducing the idea of something happening to her head.
We have the evidence, Brendan. We just need you to be honest with us.
That he cut off her hair.
What else? What else? Tell us. We know. We just got to hear it from you. And again, long pauses. He strangled her. Okay, that's not all. Long pauses. He punched her in the head. And you can tell that their frustration levels increased as this goes on.
We just need you to tell us.
That's all I can remember.
And they knew one piece of evidence that the public did not know, that she had been shot in the head. And their frustration level gets to the point where one of them just says,
all right, I'm just gonna come out and ask you, who shot her in the head?
He did.
Oops. He just blew it. And so The one piece of evidence that really could have shown that this statement was or was not true, the officers fed him and tainted the whole thing. And then ultimately, the very end of the tape, they bring his mother in. And she's like, "Brendan, what is this true?
Did you? Huh?
Not really.
What do you mean, not really?
They got to my head.
Afterward, Brendan said he made it up at their prompting. The prosecution chose not to call him as a witness at Avery's trial. But Avery's attorneys knew that Prosecutor Kratz's press conference version of Brendan's tale was already out there and would stay with jurors.
The problem was, it was like shadowboxing, because we knew the jurors had been exposed to this pretrial publicity.
Still, they believed they'd created a strong case of evidence planting and manipulation. Enough, they hoped, for the jury to have reasonable doubt. But the prosecution had one last-minute piece of evidence. Test results from the FBI that apparently proved that Avery's blood found in Teresa's car did not come from the tube of blood stored in an old evidence file. With limited time, the defense struggled to challenge the test results, and then it was over. The jury took 2 days to decide Stephen Avery's fate.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Stephen A. Avery, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide as charged in the first count of the information.
Then it was Brendan Dassey's turn. His trial began less than a month later. His attorney argued that confession of his should be thrown out, but Prosecutor Kratz argued for its admissibility, and he won.
The jury got to watch 3.5 hours of this young man's statement. They concluded that it ought to be believed, and they found him guilty.
Dassey and Avery both received life sentences. And nearly 10 years went by before the next surprising twist in the case, though not in the courtroom, but from a pair of filmmakers who had spent nearly a decade to deliver the series Making a Murderer.
We thought Stephen Avery would be an amazing window through which to look at the system.
So, the saga of crime and punishment in a small town in Wisconsin lit a controversy that's growing week by week. In the aftermath of the trial and the documentary series, the Avery case has become something of a national phenomenon. Armchair detectives all around the country dissecting the case down to its tiniest detail. Petitions have pulled in more than 500,000 signatures for Avery's release. And now, new facts are emerging. Facts that challenge assumptions on both sides of the case and throw the whole thing into doubt all over again.
All of the evidence points to one person. Points to one person being...
Ken Kratz proved his case in court almost a decade ago. But since the release of Making a Murderer, a former prosecutor finds himself trying the Stephen Avery case once again, this time in the media. Kratz, who declined to participate in the Netflix series, maintains now that the filmmakers left out crucial details that would likely give the petition signers pause.
There's so much more to this story that hasn't been told, that needs to be told, but all of the evidence, when put together cumulatively, shows beyond any doubt at all that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey took the life of this young girl.
It wasn't by chance, said Kratz, that Teresa Hallback went to the Averys that afternoon. When Stephen Avery called Auto Trader magazine on the morning of October 31st, 2005, the receptionist said Avery asked her to send the photographer who'd been there before. And instead of leaving his own contact information, Avery left his sister's.
Teresa Hallback didn't just happen on this property. Teresa Hallback was targeted by Stephen Avery.
Teresa had been to the property 6 times before. And on one of those occasions, according to a story told by a friend of Teresa's, Stephen Avery had come to the door wearing only a towel.
She told Tom Pierce, "This guy creeps me out," and he says, "Don't ever go in that house." That's all he said.
Around 2:30 that afternoon, Avery made 2 phone calls to Teresa's cell phone. But before dialing, Avery pressed star 67. According to Kratz, Avery was disguising his identification and phone number.
The filmmakers don't tell the viewer that Teresa is lured onto the property using the star 67 feature, or that different names or phone numbers are used. Teresa Halbach, I suspect, as she's driving up the Avery Road, realizes that she's been duped. She realizes, I shouldn't be here.
Phone records show Stephen Avery called Teresa's cell phone later that afternoon, around 4:30. A phone call, said Kratz, that Stephen Avery knew could not be answered. Teresa would have been dead by then.
Importantly, he doesn't use the star 67 feature. He doesn't have to. Teresa's never going to answer the phone. But he's setting up, in my opinion, an alibi. His first defense is going to be, she never showed up here.
And remember when defense attorneys discovered the hole in the old vial of Avery's blood, as seen in the Netflix series?
This is a red letter day for the defense.
This is one of the more irresponsible claims that's in this particular film. The suggestion is that this purple-topped tube was tampered with, that clearly it had a hole in the top of the tube.
According to Kratz, all of these purple-topped blood vials end up with a hole in them after use.
How do you think the blood got in there? The blood gets in there by putting a hole in it. There was a nurse that was interviewed and said, I'm the one that put the hole in there.
Also presented at trial, but not included in the Netflix series, DNA evidence found on the outside hood latch of Teresa's car, which, according to Kratz, came from the skin and sweat on Avery's fingers.
But it's important because there was no suggestion that officers had vials of Mr. Avery's sweat with them.
And Teresa's charged cell phone and camera were found in a burn barrel outside Avery's trailer door. Another detail covered in the trial, but omitted from the documentary. And Kratz offers his answer to a question on many viewers' minds. Why was Teresa's blood in her car if she was killed in Stephen's garage?
We find later, when Brendan Dassey is interviewed, that he and Uncle Stephen, after she was shot in the garage, they, in his words, threw her in the back of the SUV while deciding how to dispose of her body. They originally had planned on placing the body in a pond, believing there wasn't enough water in the pond. Stephen Avery carried out the plan to burn her.
But Stephen Avery's defense lawyer, Jerry Buting, who did participate in the documentary, disputes much of Ken Kratz's campaign to dismantle the Netflix series. For example, the state's theory that Stephen Avery targeted Teresa Halbach that day.
They were trying to make it sound like he was luring Teresa Halbach to come out to his auto salvage yard where he could commit this dastardly crime. She was the only photographer for Auto Trader in that whole area of the state. So he doesn't say send Teresa Halbach. He says, but, you know, send that woman that you had out here to take pictures again. We want to put another vehicle in your magazine.
And Buting dismisses the state's theory that Avery was trying to hide his identity.
Problem with that theory was, if he already had her cell phone, then all he had to do was call her cell phone and have her come out there. But instead, he called the Auto Trader office and made an appointment. And now then he says, well, but he used a false name. Well, he didn't use a false name. He used his sister's name, B. Yonda.
And there's a simple explanation for that. Why Avery left his sister's contact information rather than his own?
Because the vehicle that she was to take pictures of was his sister's vehicle. And she was the one who ultimately would be the seller of the transfer of the title. So Mr. Kratz has really misrepresented what that evidence was about.
As for the vial of Avery's blood, well, the film focused on the discovery of the hole. Buting said he was more interested in another clue.
If you looked carefully, there's blood in between the stopper and the glass. which you could only get if the stopper's taken out. That looked suspicious.
And Buting has his own questions about Avery's DNA found on the hood of Teresa's car.
There were no fingerprints at all of Stephen Avery on the hood latch, on the hood itself, on the grill, anywhere near that. So how does he get his DNA on the hood latch, but not his fingerprints? If he's wearing gloves, he's not going to get his DNA on it.
Above all, defense attorney Jerry Buting faults not just the evidence that was gathered, but the evidence that wasn't.
If, in fact, the only evidence pointed towards Stephen Avery, it's because that's all they investigated.
And now, with Avery and Dassey pushing for new trials, many are beginning to ask another burning question. Who else could have killed Teresa Hallback? Since Making a Murderer premiered in December 2015, new information is emerging that may help Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. While both have filed numerous appeals and have had those appeals denied at the state level, new questions are being raised about the jury in the trial. One unnamed juror claimed to have been pressured to vote guilty. Another, also unnamed, believed that not only had Stephen Avery murdered Teresa Hallback, but that he raped and tortured her as well. The charges of rape and torture, well now known to series viewers, were never heard in court during Avery's trial. But they were articulated by DA Ken Kratz during his press conference 1 year earlier, a point of contention for the defense.
That shows how the outrageously improper press conference that Mr. Kratz gave tainted the entire jury pool in the entire state of Wisconsin and leaked into this trial and affected the verdict in this case.
The documentary has spawned a nation of amateur sleuths picking apart the evidence and asking many probing questions about the case, especially the big one.
Well, if Stephen Avery didn't do this, then who did?
In a 2009 appeal, Stephen Avery named 4 possible alternative suspects, including 2 of his own brothers.
He didn't accuse them of killing her, but have said that they could have.
There are several of the Averys who have been convicted of various sexual assault charges over the years.
Chuck and Earl Avery each had previously pleaded no contest in assaults against women. In the same appeal, Avery also singled out his brother-in-law, Scott Todick, and nephew Bobby, Brendan's brother. On the day Teresa went missing, each used the other as an alibi. All 4 men have denied any involvement in Teresa's murder. In January 2016, a new high-profile attorney agreed to take on Avery's appeal. Kathleen Zellner has helped to win exonerations and releases for 17 wrongfully convicted men. But to get Stephen's case reopened, she must uncover compelling new evidence.
I've had emails from over 100 scientists from all over the world that have watched this documentary that are reaching out saying, hey, you gotta understand, there's new things that can be done.
The creators of Making a Murderer, Laura Ricciardi and Maura Demos, defend the editorial choices they've made.
It would have been impossible for us to include all of the evidence that the state submitted. We chose all of what the state itself was claiming to be its most compelling evidence. All of that evidence is in the series. We feel that we did a very thorough, a very accurate and fair job.
But former prosecutor Ken Kratz is angry about one thing the filmmakers did include: the story of how he lost his job after sexting female crime victims.
To suggest that those behaviors not only were present 3 years earlier or 5 years earlier when the whole case started, but to say that somehow it impacted decisions I made or the prosecution or investigation decisions I made is absolutely unfair.
And Kratz is vehement in his conviction that regardless of implications in Making a Murderer, justice was served.
Stephen Avery was convicted. He received a life sentence, no possibility of parole. That man's right where he needs to be.
For the families of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, though, the series has meant an outpouring of support.
Random strangers are seeing what we went through and enduring that pain and just sharing with us that they've cried, just seeing what Brendan went through.
Brendan's half-brother, Brad Dassey, has been so moved by the public's response, he even wrote a song about the case.
They didn't do it, no. Come to your senses, everything is just foolish. Things clearly show that it was just a joke. Cops were only there just to...
Why has the series produced such strong reactions? Some say it offers a window into troubling aspects of the legal system.
There are many cases where things like this happen, certainly when it comes to the police interrogation techniques of vulnerable people. And, these are the kinds of questions that people should be asking.
What about the knife? Where's the knife? Be honest with me.
Of all the scenes in the film, it is perhaps the interview with Brendan Dassey by investigators that has prompted the most public outrage.
I think the interrogation techniques that were used on Brendan Dassey were legitimately troubling to a lot of viewers of the Netflix documentary.
Sure.
How long is this going to take?
It shouldn't take a whole lot longer.
Do you think I can get there before 129?
Probably not. What's at 129?
Well, I had a project doing 6 though.
Okay.
Former prosecutor Ken Kratz stands by the interrogation methods used on Brendan Dassey.
Brendan was able to resist suggestibility.
His half-brother disagrees.
He was defenseless. He didn't know what to say or do. And honestly, a murderer would ask to go back to school. I firmly believe that they did take advantage of his cognitive behavior, and I think he was a target.
But it's Stephen Avery and his claim that he's once again the victim of a legal system that's supposed to protect the innocent, who has become the unlikely flashpoint for a national debate about justice in America.
Stay tuned. This saga is not over.